Hey, well, welcome everyone to the April 2025 episode of the ongoing bi-monthly FR Panorama webinar series. I'm Larry Liberti, and together with my co-host Mario Alanis, will be your co-host today for this webinar, which we will be looking into the essential role of emergency use pathways. And we'll be referring to these as EUPs throughout the day. So thank you very much for joining us. And as usual, there's so much to share and to discuss. So we'll keep our introductions short. FR Panorama is an educational program of the RUD Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it's presented in collaboration with the University of Southern California's DK Kim International Center for Regulatory Science, which together bring you the FR Path project. We're really grateful for the ongoing support provided by MSD for the FR Panorama series. You know, our not so distant experiences with the global response to the COVID-19 epidemic highlighted strengths and opportunities for improvement in our ability to respond to important emergency situations. And one of the important learnings was the value and role of emergency use pathways, EUPs, in the development and regulatory assessment of diagnostics and therapeutics and vaccines. Now, EUPs are not new. They've been around for a decade or more, but traditionally they've found limited use, usually among the more mature regulatory agencies and certainly the WHO. But today, these pathways are finding an ever-widening presence. In fact, an analysis of the FR Path database, supported by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, has identified almost 50 emergency use pathways across 37 countries and the WHO. And these include countries as diverse as Botswana and India, Bolivia, and China, not to mention the US and others. But their characteristics are diverse, and the types of products they can be used for and the role they play in a country's public health system vary widely. So, how do developers and regulators collaborate to meet urgent patient needs? How do we optimize the use of EUPs? Well, to understand the issues involved in taking the learnings from the past years and seeing how we can contribute to optimizing the use of EUPs, today we're looking at this from several unique points of view.
Thank you, Larry. Oh, I'm so excited about today's session. I think it's so important. And today's session reminds me of the experience we lived in Mexico, my country, during COVID-19. At the time, there was not any EUP, emergency use pathway, in Mexico. And obviously, it had to be developed, and it was developed under pressure and urgency, and maybe with some delay in access. That was a very important lesson, and I think it's a very important lesson for countries that do not have, and as well as for countries who have them and do not use them often. That you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared in order to minimize the improvisation whenever an unfortunate event happens, like epidemic or a national disaster. So it is very important to think and reflect, and that's what we are going to do today, about what has to be done to be prepared to respond to an epidemic or a national disaster. And that's exactly the purpose of today's session. We're going to deep dive into this world of EUPs. And we are joined by two wonderful speakers. There was another speaker that had a technical problem, but I'm going to review who will be with us. On one hand, we have Deborah Jeske, who is from CEPI, as Larry mentioned, it's the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. And she will discuss with us in her presentation what are the characteristics and goals of effective EUPs. I think it's a very important topic that it's not only important to have them, but for them to be effective. And we will be as well joined by Dr. Anna Lisieux, who was with us previously, and you know her. She is the Regulatory and Policy Intelligence Director for AstraZeneca, and she will share her company's experience, analysis, and studies on how EUPs facilitate the availability of critical public health goods. So let's get started. So I'm happy to introduce Deborah Jeske. She is the lead for global regulatory policy and intelligence at the CEPI, the Coalition for Economic Preparedness. And you know, CEPI has shown significant leadership in the use of innovative approaches to address global epidemic crisis. So we look forward to Deborah Insights. Deborah, it's over to you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Mario, for inviting me here today to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart: emergency use pathways and regulatory preparedness. And like Larry mentioned, that CEPI, we did approach Larry and Mario tail end of the active. While COVID was still active, to see if we could start to populate the FR Path portal with emergency use pathways. And it was something that was on our plate at CEPI regulatory to begin with, to look at this prior to the pandemic. However, and it would have been great to have that snapshot before the pandemic and how many emergency use pathways in the different national regulatory authorities toolkit were available, and then take a picture after the pandemic to see. Now we know, of course, that there are many regulatory authorities that have this provision. And so we didn't get the chance to do it before, but we definitely we know it afterwards, and still there are some that don't have them, and we do at CEPI regulatory have an extensive network of regulatory authorities, regulators that we talk to a lot, and so working through that, and I can get to that in some subsequent slides here. So I just want to start to talk about why emergency use pathways are important. And these next three slides, these are not exhaustive lists, but I think that these, to me, are the most important. So the emergency use pathways, and Mario said it, and it's very important. It's to make sure that regulatory authorities have these tools in their toolbox before the next public health emergency, so that you don't have to be doing it at the 11th hour, and so that you're intentional about setting these emergency pathways up for your agency. So it does allow for rapid response, quickly authorize the use of unapproved products or unapproved uses of approved products. So that making sure that those, and I'll call them medical countermeasures, MCMs, that are available to respond with. Again, access to critical MCMs, medical countermeasures, to enable the use of, potentially life-saving treatments or diagnostics. Diagnostics, as we saw during COVID response, was had a lot of emergency use authorizations to be used for diagnostic purposes as well. It's very important. It gives the regulators flexibility in that what's the flexibility is needed to adapt to what's happening on the ground. So if there's something that's changing with the outbreak or the pandemic or whatever is going on, it gives the regulator flexibilities to respond to that, the ever-changing landscape in a public health emergency. And then it does strengthen the public health by facilitating the availability of these medical countermeasures. So these next two slides build upon that first slide. And again, not an all-inclusive list, but some of the characteristics that should be included in any emergency use pathway, that it has to be evidence-based decision-making. Following the science, following, the data and information that's presented from a developer to a regulator to be used, again, for inclusion into the response of a public health emergency. Defining the scope of an emergency use pathway, since there are, all kinds of, as I mentioned, diagnostics, treatments, vaccines, different biologics, monoclonal antibodies, and the like. So making sure that the emergency use pathway defines the different scopes of those elements, and as well as making sure that in the characteristic of the emergency use pathway is defining how monitoring and reporting will be assessed. And this is important, again, as things change, as the public health emergency progresses, giving the regulator the flexibility to monitor for adverse events and different things to making, and then having that flexibility to make those changes. And here I just put some pictures here of what's actually on the FR Path portal of different emergency use pathways. And the other characteristic I think that is very important of an emergency use pathway, and we found out from COVID, a lot of regulators put specific emergency use pathways in for specifically COVID. But once the COVID pandemic was over, it really is important to make sure that the emergency use pathway is fit for purpose for any public health emergency. So you can see on the left-hand side there is the interim order was specific for COVID, and that agency it would be prudent to then make sure that there are provisions to respond to any specific public health emergency, and then some specific pandemic pathway, and then just a broad emergency use authorization. So I think the important goals of any emergency use pathway is obviously, one, to facilitate the authorization and distribution of a medical countermeasure in response to a public health emergency. And this is, because every emergency happens locally first, to help contain that local emergency outbreak, whatever, and then locally, regionally, and nationally, trying to contain any kind of public health emergency in that regard, which helps then support the global health security, and then it also facilitates and enhances international collaboration in that regard. So, WHO, ICMRA, and this last little graphic is the global health security agenda. So these three entities, and not only these three, but were very important within, for responding to public health emergencies of international concern, things of that nature. And ICMRA played a really important role during COVID, and suspect that in future outbreaks, pandemics, and global public health emergencies, that they'll continue to play a very important role. So switching to that is that the things that we can now do during peacetime preparedness, and this is very near and dear to my heart and to CEPI's heart, is, and this is specific to regulators for establishing public or emergency use pathways, is to develop clear regulatory frameworks, that making sure that there are legal provisions that underpin those emergency use pathways, as well as defining the criteria and the processes in which to facilitate and to use a pathway like that. Within the context of the regulatory agency, is building capacity and expertise within the agencies, establishing, enhancing electronic regulatory systems is very important for speed and access, is important. Conducting exercise and drills, just like what Mario said, it's important to not only establish a pathway, but to exercise and, you know, hopefully not use it all the time, but to exercise its use and to hold drills and the like. We at CEPI have been recently meeting with regulatory authorities in our priority region, Southeast Asia, Global South, and to include the continent of Africa as well as Latin America, in holding regulatory tabletop exercises, which are useful for the regulators, because sometimes coming from the US, and I was with the U.S. government prior to joining CEPI, we were very used to doing tabletop exercises with multi-stakeholders from, from law enforcement, from, from health sciences and all manners of government coming together. That might not be capable or doable from a country perspective all the time. So making sure that the regulatory agencies can understand, how things will flow during an emergency. So doing tabletop exercises, I think, and again, like we've just started that at the end of last year, and we'll be continuing it now with our regional regulatory experts. So I think it's been very, very useful for them to walk through those exercises. And I have my last slide. We'll talk a little bit more about preparedness piece. So that also feeds into collaborating with stakeholders such as other regulatory authorities, making sure that, what we would like to see, CEPI would like to see, is, we're a very big proponent of one world, one dossier, to increase or to establish information equity among regulators during public health emergencies. And so using reliance mechanisms, and I know that FR Path and Larry and Mario are very big proponents of reliance, and it's been topic during these forums on many instances. And so making sure that MOUs and reliance mechanisms with regulatory colleagues and other agencies are up to date, because we saw a lot of reliance during COVID as well. Also, establishing enhanced communications, and making sure that even having canned messages ready to go, because the last thing that it's hard to do during an event is to make sure that your messaging is clear and straightforward. Some of this, for preparedness purposes, I did include we do have a pandemic preparedness playbook that has a lot of great of information, and we CEPI are not, we're not in the business of recreating the wheel, but we do give some very good links to information in that and playbook, and that is the web address or the link to the playbook. And the biggest part here is, as much as can be done during peacetime only helps facilitate the emergency phase and the emergency response. So getting all your ducks in a row is very important to making sure that your response is not perfect. It won't ever be perfect. You can exercise your plans and everything. It will never go the way that you exercise it or plan for it, but it will be a lot better than it would be if you didn't. And so that's, I think, one of the driving messages here. The other thing I just wanted to talk about is that along with the tabletop exercises, when we go out to the regulator meetings with specific regulators, we are using what we're calling CEPI's regulatory readiness dashboard. And you can see on the left-hand side, these are the aspects that we are talking to regulators about, and making sure that, and this dashboard will be green, yellow, red, and as they walk through it. And I think that it gives them a really good starting point if they haven't started to think about these specific things as far as regulatory readiness. But it also helps with their thinking and how they will respond in any kind of strategic plan that they have for public health emergencies. And we know in the regulatory arena that the regulators did a heroic job during COVID. And while I think the naysayers prior to the pandemic always thought that the regulators were going to be the rate limiting step, and they were so proactive and just working lockstep with industry that they absolutely were not the rate limiting step, and that was just responding to the pandemic without doing some of these things that I've talked about this morning on preparedness. And so it lends itself to the next public health emergency being all that more prepared. So I will stop there, and thank you for your attention, and hand it over to you, Mario and Larry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Deb. This reminds me of some work that I was able to do with colleagues at Utrecht University immediately after things started to become available. Vaccines started to become available for COVID. So this was like in early 21. And if you remember, some of the first vaccines became available like in December of 20. And what we did was we took a look in Latin America, how did these roll out? And it turns out that in many, many cases, reliance was used. And the time periods necessary to roll out these vaccines in the Latin American countries were, like you said, incredibly brief. I mean, we were talking about weeks, sometimes a month or so, but those were actually the longer time periods. So it showed that the regulators were able to use their systems, even though not everybody had a formal EUP in place. They had systems that could help them accelerate what was going on. And I think, so you make a very good point about the need to have a relationship between the agency and the industry.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect lead-in, actually. And Mario, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker. So our let's see, Anna will call you on up. And some of you are familiar already with Anna, who's participated in another one of our sessions. And so right now, what we're going to do is we're going to ask Anna to give us a little bit of an insight. Anna is involved with international regulatory policy at AstraZeneca, and we'd like to take a closer look at EUPs from the developer's point of view. AstraZeneca has had a lot of experience here, and as important new vaccines and therapeutics are developed, and pharmaceutical developers are looking to EUPs to facilitate the availability of these critically important products, How is your organization taking with this, Anna? We'd like you to share your experiences and tell us a little bit more about what you see from the industry point of view about the value of EUPs and how they can be used. So if you could talk a little bit about how EUPs are facilitating the availability of critical public health products, we'd really appreciate it. So welcome, Anna, and over to you. Now, I have your slides, Anna, and I can advance them on your command.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, thank you very much. And I think with Deb's introductory presentation, I think some key points that I would like to highlight in takeaways is basically innovation, collaboration, and reliance. So basically, my slides that cover some of the points that, next please, that Debs has already covered. This is a disclaimer. This is my own opinions. Not representing AstraZeneca. And basically what we would like to paint is why these emergency usage are important, what are the barriers and how they can address, then how emergency usage pathways do, address some of the challenges, because it's nicely, noted from the research that has just been shared, is that it is an area for innovation, and we can share also some, of the information, some of our experience with our COVID vaccine, but also how these emergency usage pathways can can be used really in cases where we have challenges with the shortage of medicines, for example, and how we can overcome these challenges, and with conclusions and takeaways. Next, please. So I think I think for the emergency usage pathways, as we said, one of the key things that these pathways represent, and I think it's important for all agencies, all of the 200 countries that we have on this on this planet, is really to adopt these emergency usage pathways to address urgent public health needs, and also, as Deb's noted, and as Larry and as our panel notes, is that allows basically to facilitate rapid access in critical circumstances in pandemics, but not only this, in other cases where a market really needs access of important medicines to meet public health needs. As it was noted, they can be used across essential medicines, vaccines, and diagnostics, and where where AstraZeneca innovated in this space, it was with our COVID vaccine. And they are very important because it's an area where you can innovate. You can use collaboration, trust, basically in a timely manner to bring to your population, in a very short time, these important medicines. Next, please. And basically, what another key thing, and what are really what are really the need for these ones, for these type of pathways, what they can address, because what we're seeing in our world is that we have basically medicine shortage, which basically puts patient safety in a threat, also impacts the public health, and for our health systems, public health, their safety, having the medicines there are very important. Also, what we are seeing, we have supply chain disruptions and complexity. We saw this one at the COVID time. But what we are seeing, and you see later on in our example, is that even if you have, delays, you can think out of the box. Stakeholders, thinking, collaborating with other, organizations, to get over these regulatory, hurdles, because historically regulatory reviews are known for the long lead times. Also, another challenge is that, you know, no reliance being applied. Also, as Debs noted, you know, pre-COVID, you know, a number of agents did not have emergency usage, but through this COVID, through this pandemic, you know, lots of agencies did innovate while at the same time they were reviewing, while at the same time they were updating the legislation within days, not within months, not within years. And also, you know, and also that's important, also having this type of pathways to be able to address timely manner access of therapies. It allows, you know, to address, you know, circumstances where we have delayed treatments, where we can reduce mortality, morbidity, but also we can, you know, we can address how we can improve the quality of care. Next, please. So basically, you know, how emergencies, I did cover on my next slide, how basically the emergency usage the emergency usage procedures do address some of these ones. I think these have been, you know, covered by Dex, but I think, you know, what it allows is like the timely, rapid authorization. And we see later on some of the examples through our experience on how fast some agencies did approve. But it is an opportunity, you know, to innovate. It is an opportunity to pass, you know, to basically to be more bold, to take more risk approach review in this circumstance. Trust, for example, the data is not in the previous presentation. You know, to trust the data that come from other agencies, not to do a full review, for example. Also, it allows, you know, supply chain coordinations, and we'll see later on, allows, you know, to think out of the box and how we can use our legal frameworks to be flexible, you know, to have flexible supply chains, and we'll share with you, you know, some of our experience. Also, the priority, you know, focus on the resources on the products with the highest public health impact. As noted earlier, when we don't have these emergencies, how can we, you know, what are the lessons learned? How can we include this? But also we can use it as a scanning, you know, scanning the horizon and using some of these pathways, you know, to adapt, you know, in challenging circumstances. Import-export flexibility, because we do know sometimes you can have the license, you can have the approval, but sometimes a challenge is the import-export regulations at our borders. And of course, you know, like as you say, with the horizon scanning at the non-emergency circumstances, you know, is how can we identify these potential products? How can we be flexible? So through our experience, next please, within the AstraZeneca, what we are saw during, you know, that period of time is what we can say is true innovation. Basically, traditional vaccines are being developed and delivered over, you know, traditionally over 10 years. You know, it takes 10 years, you know, to do your studies, to deliver the whole package to your regulatory authorities for registration. But what we saw within AstraZeneca with our COVID vaccine, Vaxzevria, is that we did that one within 18 months. Another key thing is that we had one core dossier with the same information, and also to be flexible and to provide the vaccine across more than 100. We had multiple supply chains within the international region. And not only this one, also we had, you know, reference agencies. Apart from, you know, European Medicines Agency, also we have, you know, other reference agencies, like for example, South Korea was one of our, you know, reference agencies. Also, we did parallel submissions. For example, one of our first submissions, you know, was we submitted the dossier to European Medicines Agency and to the World Health Organization, and also working with the different, you know, reference agencies. It allows, you know, to have more than one supply chain. Also within, what we did, we had agreements with other organizations, for example, to allow more flexibility, but also to have further outreach. And our medicine had more than one marketing authorization holder. In those regions where we have that we as an AstraZeneca was the marketing authorization holder, we had more than 30 emergency emergency uses licenses across all regions. And what we did see there, basically, in average, in approximately in a median time, we saw about 80 days review time. So we use like kind of median, but and usually within the international region, regulatory reviews, the average between 15 to 18 months. But what we saw, for example, in some cases, we saw approval within 1 day, in some cases within 1 week, but usually it was within 80 days, which is about approximately 4 months. And another key thing is partnership. Very, very important for us to reach out. The lessons learned here is collaboration, coordination, trust other partners that they can take your technology and they can produce it basically for their own populations or other markets. And basically through this partnership, our vaccine reached out to more than 150 countries. Also, another key thing, as we said, in terms of innovation, we had one cordoche that was being used with multiple supply chains, but it was the same product, same quality, same specifications, and etc. But also, importantly, on the front of digitalization, we achieved, we had our pack of our vaccine, and that was paperless. It did not have a patient information leaflet. And what we had one electronic product information leaflet where the patients, the healthcare professionals could go to the website, they could find the English version, but also they could access it, in their respective language. So basically, from our experience, what you can say is truly innovation, is really collaboration, and it's truly when we need us as healthcare providers, either the industry, either the public sector, truly we can innovate, we can trust each other, and we can make it happen. Next, please. So basically, the key message that we want, to really to achieve this, to use this type of pathways, not only for the emergency, is that the secret ingredient to that is collaboration. As you saw, us signing up agreements with other key organizations, using other reference agencies, like for example from Korea, it helps us really to have a further outreach. Of course, we have the challenges, where, we'll need to ensure that the public organizations, ensure to update their product list. How can we think out of the box to have more equitable access? How can we make our cross borders more flexible in terms of import and export? But also another key thing that we saw, and it was sometimes challenging, is how these regulatory frameworks, these emergency usage licenses or regulatory frameworks can be included in the national regulatory authorities legal framework, but to be consistent, not to be divergent. Because what we are seeing, when some of these new pathways are being used or are being embedded, somehow they diverge. And sometimes they are called conditional approvals, sometimes emergency uses, and etc. The other key thing that we saw is about reliance in these emergency usage pathways. Reliance is very, very important. We did see in our experience the usage of reliance, but not extensively, because agencies still had, even within the 80 days to review. So how can we breathe reliance, trust within these pathways to have the have the products being accessible to our patients faster? And of course, about mindset. is not only, it's not only pandemic, it's also, it can address other areas. For example, if you have shortages, if you have, like, for example, natural disasters, we can innovate, we can think out of the box, we can collaborate. Next, please. So I think the key, the key takeaways, I think, I would focus more on the bolded, really for the, for to have these pathways to be effective, they should be incorporated, they should be convergent, not divergent, adding more information, for example, additional documentation, being embedded in the regulatory framework, and also, collaboration. And also applying reliance. If a reference agency has approved the dossier, for example, through the World Health Organization in collaboration with, with other, stringent regulatory authorities, is why we don't apply reliance. Very important. And of course, another key thing is innovate. What we have seen for some of us who have worked in the industry for a very long time, truly we saw innovation. How can we take this innovation forwards, not only in this space, and also with all the new modalities that are coming our way? Thank you. And that was my key takeaways: innovation, reliance, collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. What I was struck by was the alignment between what you were talking about from the company point of view and what Deb was talking about. And perhaps we can bring Deb in and we can have a little bit of a conversation around some of the items that you've talked about. A couple of questions have popped up, and just wanted to start the conversation. So we've heard about reliance, right? And the thing about reliance is that you have to rely on something. And you mentioned the reference agencies and WHO. So if we want to use reliance in a pandemic, epidemic situation, an emergency use situation, those reference agencies have to move very quickly, right? Because we don't want them to be the rate limiting step. And what are there recommendations or observations that you've seen that allow these reference agencies to move quickly such that the rest of the world can use them as part of their reliance initiatives? And maybe we'll start with Anna, and then Deb, if you have some thoughts about that, and especially from the point of view of the tabletop exercises maybe that you've been undertaking around the world. So Anna, you first, and then Deb.
I think one of the key areas, one of the kind of messages that Debbie did touch through the roundtables is that collaboration and having synergistic reviews, because we do know through the World Health Organization collaborating with the European Medicines Agency, that allows to have faster reviews, but also sharing knowledge, sharing your expertise. So using cross-border collaborative methodologies that we see, it can help, especially to fast track even our more advanced agencies to have faster review. I don't know, that's what you think.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that it remains to be seen how fast those reference agencies will move and work. I mean, it's to me even today surreal about the whole globe, everybody focusing on one thing, and it just it goes to show you when everyone is focusing on one thing, how much can get done and how quickly, right? And so hopefully, let's hope that we never have that again. But I do think that through tabletop exercise, being prepared, taking the time through peacetime to be prepared, and having those tools in the toolbox as far as not only emergency use pathways, but accelerated pathways for different pathogens. I can tell you that of course CEPI has a core portfolio of priority pathogens that we're working on because there's no market for that. So we're trying to bridge that gap. The other thing is using it still remains to be seen on how quickly a reference agency moves, but it can even talk about the EMA setting up the emergency task force. That is huge in and of itself, right? So that they have a specific body that can move things that need to move quicker than maybe something traditionally. So I'll leave that there.
Wow. I would like to, as Larry mentioned, it's fascinating how similar messages and how it seems like it was very well coordinated between both of you. But one thing I liked very much of Debbie was the dashboard. I think it's fascinating to have in the tabletop exercises. It's like a great checklist, and I think it was very good, and I think it should be promoted a lot. And the other thing I was thinking when I heard you both is how emergencies versus promoting reliance, it's a matter of numbers. Emergency is for many people, but the same arguments justify for one life. It's obviously in emergencies, it's a lot of people, but in the same way that we promote reliance is and collaboration, for somebody it's urgent, those medicines. So it's so important, and I think so few countries really are prepared. And with the climate crisis, unfortunately, it seems that maybe not global, but in different parts of the world, it's likely to have those kind of emergencies. So it's so important to advance in these topics. Well, those are ideas and comments. I don't know if you have any thought.
I mean, I can just chip in here. I mean, I think that you're right, Mario. And when I was with the U.S. government, it was very important for me. I was at the CDC at the time to making sure that the things that we had in the strategic national stockpile, right, to respond to chem, bio, rad, nuke, pandemic, influenza, and any other kind of public health emergency, is that if that there were regulatory mechanisms for everything that was in that stockpile that wasn't yet approved, because of course we were also this was the precursor to BARDA, actually, and so making sure that we had everything in there that had a regulatory mechanism for the onesies and twosies, right, and then for a population. And that was different. And you're right. And I don't know, since leaving the government and focusing, in CEPI on global regulatory, I don't know if there are those mechanisms within, especially, the smaller agencies. Definitely, the FDAs and the EMAs have those pathways, Health Canada and the like. But as far as, maybe the low and middle income country regulators, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and that leads into a question that's come up is, if an agency doesn't have an EUP in place, you had both mentioned things like alternatives, like accelerated pathways, conditional marketing authorizations, things like that. Are there unique differences between, let's say, a traditional conditional marketing authorization versus what an EUP does? Like, why would they need to put an EUP in place if they have a conditional marketing authorization pathway in place? And doesn't that become tricky then for the sponsor, for the pharmaceutical company, to say, well, which one should I use? Should I use the conditional marketing authorization? Should I use the EUP? So tell me a little bit about what you're seeing with regard to the characteristics of these pathways and how one decides which one to use.
So in our case, when we did where AstraZeneca was the marketing authorization application, what we saw with this emergency use is these are they're emergency licenses that they allow you basically to use them for a certain time, and then if you want, then you have to convert it to normal marketing authorization application, because it addresses that timely access, basically. Now, so basically, the particularity of the emergency usage is that, it has a certain time point that, it can expire. And then if you want to, then you have to convert it into a proper license. Because it's kind of like an early access, basically. And, I think we did talk about last time, Larry and Mario, about early access. So it's more how can you have early access of these medicines that's, that we have developed. We have enough data, right, to trust, to be, the benefit, the risk, etc., is validated on the data and on the science. I think in terms, and in some cases, you see with this, and the conditional approvals, like, can we see the full data sets? Can we see all the post-approval, data that as they come through, and all that? I think if a country does not have it, they could use an accelerated review. They can use another pathway, but potentially they could apply reliance, so then they can, shorten the time, for example, of the review. Wherever there is will, there is a way.
Yeah, I think that's where you're talking about being thinking out of the box. So trying to figure out what would be the most appropriate pathway for that particular event. And Deb, is that kind of your feeling, your experience?
Yeah, I think definitely, emergency use pathways between versus conditional approvals, right? So, like, for instance, EMA is a conditional approval, which is a real license. It's not an authorization to then be converted into, but they're similar but different. But the authorizations, the emergency use authorizations, like Anna said, is that they then need to convert over to something real, and they're time bound, and and need to convert to something real. Conditional does too, but it starts out as a real license to begin with, so it has a little bit more,
right,
meat to it. So yeah.
So can I ask you a tough question? Oh, go ahead, Mario.
I was thinking that one aspect very important, and maybe we have to do more. I don't know what it's like training and consciousness to realize people that it's important to have them, because in a country authorities change, and maybe at some point they can react rapidly. But if you have it more institutionalized, so you have to make conscious many people that and to explain why it's so relevant. I think that this discussing like we're doing here, but like in more fora that of this importance. I don't know.
Well, I do think that's very important. And then my last point on that one slide was, clear communications, and starting to think about those clear communications prior to an event, talking about specifically the emergency use pathways, that, corners are not being cut. There still is safety. And, as we lived through COVID, having people saying that, well, there was metal in the vaccines and I could stick something on metal on my my arm and it would stick there. Those are like crazy things. And I, even some of my kids were like saying something like, do you think that, pharmaceutical developers or, vaccine developers, or governments, we don't have the time to think about something so odd to do that, but it's an education campaign, and it's not only within the professional landscape here that we're here, but it is to the general population as well, to facilitate trust.
Yeah,
trust.
So Deb, I have one more observation, and this may be a tricky one, right? We are all talking about how the FDA is being impacted in various ways with regard to its manpower and its role in international policy, international activities. Do you think that as a reference agency, and one that actually had quite a number of facilitated pathways in place in response to COVID, that there will be a continuing need to look to FDA for its authorization of these important products first as a reference agency? Do you think that there are kind of out of the box ways of looking at this? We can ask Anna about this too. I guess what everybody's trying to figure out is, with all the changes at FDA, how might it impact something like emergency preparedness globally?
That is tricky. Thank you. Thank you for giving that to me. Look, I used to work at FDA, and I love my FDA colleagues and friends, right? But I will say that even prior to the pandemic, or not pandemic, even prior to, post January 20th, it's difficult. It's difficult to use FDA as a reference agency because of their highly redacted, summary basis of approval or any kind of documents. Even within regulator to regulator, they feel that they need to have specific one-to-one MOUs with regulatory authorities before they would share unredacted their unredacted reports. I mean, it still just blows my mind that they share the redacted reports with even the developer that has the approved product. But so I think that they were starting to, as we were seeing or asking them, the world, asking them to be, the reference agencies to share with, low and middle income country regulators, that they can't do that because of their regulations not allowing them to do that. So that only puts the pressure now because of, what's going on here. So, it remains to be seen. I still think that, and Anna can talk to this more than I, that, because of the different regulatory pathways that they have, that it still is, attractive maybe for industry to come here to get approvals through those pathways, and then, working to maybe other regulatory authorities such as EMA, Health Canada, TGA, and things of that nature.
Anna, last word to you.
Yeah, I think based on our experience, we have a number of stringent regulatory authorities like US FDA. So based on our experience, for us to have timely access, we worked, with other regulators to be our reference agencies. For example, South Korea, also working through partnerships where we have other organizations, like for example, where we worked with the Indian organization, the Serum Institute of India, to produce and get the license from the Indian agency, and then, to get licenses, to get the product, being distributed in other low and medium income. So I think from perspectives of choice of the agencies, typically, we are submitting our dossiers in parallel to more than one agency, not only to the US FDA. So there is an opportunity for us, to see what is the best strategy, and that's why strategy is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing is, I think from a reliance perspective, knowing and usually from an industry perspective, what we are advocate is to use the public assessment reports, because these are the final approval, the final decision of a mature agency, and this is where trust, this is where collaboration is very important, and I think this is where agencies like ICMRA, for example, through the pilots, doing these collaborative reviews, in the future you could have the emergency uses being done, through ICMRA, through a platform. Digitalization is very hot, where they can see, the data in real time, where they don't need assessment potentially reports, but then, everyone can see the same data. They can, observe, but then, can trust the final product, which is the approval. So then they can bring the medicine into the patient.
Well, actually, we got a kind of a last minute question in again, and so I'd like to pose this to you, and I think I can start it. And the question really has to do with experience in Latin America, with regard to health authorities and the performance of those authorities in terms of their EUPs. And as I had mentioned, a study that I was involved with Utrecht University, it has been published. You can search it on the internet and find it. We found that in Latin America, particularly, there was lots of activity very, very early on across many, many different countries and many different kinds of vaccines. Not only, you know, the ones that we were more familiar with, the AstraZeneca ones, but also Sinovac and others that were being used in other parts of the world. They were starting to look at those, and either through reliance or through their own mechanisms in their EUPs, they were approving these relatively quickly. So by the time April or so came around, many vaccines had been approved very, very quickly in Latin America. So, Deb, what's your overall experience with EUPs in LATAM? And then Anna, one last word to you.
I can't really say that I have any specific experience, but I will say this for COVID, for specifics. You know, WHO, CEPI, and Gavi set up the COVAX, right, or the Access to Medical Countermeasures Initiative Act Accelerator, and through that we stood up COVAX for vaccines. So we put together a regulatory advisory group that had a number of different regulators around the globe, and we had at the beginning we had Anvisa and unmet on that group. And in conjunction with the WHO consultations, as well as the ICMR meetings, and sometimes they serendipitously fell in lockstep. Like 1 week, it was the COVAX, it's the RAG, Regulatory Advisory Group, and then WHO consultation, and then ICMR. I think what happened during those meetings and calls is that regulators got to hear a lot of what we were seeing from our developers and questions and maybe challenges there. They would also hear it in the consultation and then ICMR. And I think that really set regulators up, and especially seeing that, you know, there was so much, work, expedited work being done in the LATAM region, is that they got the benefit of hearing from all different regulators, even, you know, the big reference ones, FDA, EMA, Health Canada, and the like, got to hear these conversations, and then were able to take it back into their agencies to talk about it and help them respond to what's, you know, what they needed to do. So I think that it was a really, really great thing to watch happen. And so that's from our experience, what we saw, having, you know, these different regulatory bodies talk to each other. And then even though maybe some of those regulators during those meetings weren't the ones leading the discussions, but they definitely took it back and then had action within their own regulatory agencies that were definitely expedited.
Yeah, so there was that learning that you were talking about. And Anna, last words.
To complement that, you know, I think through our vaccine, we did work through with COVAX. We saw that reliance was practiced through the, COVAX. And I think it's just going back to what I like that you said about these like round tables where people come together, they listen, they're part of this collaboration of this round table. And I think, this is where this collaboration, through this type of, frameworks like COVAX, like ICMA, for example, you have the people that are part, they can, feel trusted, and they can hear, the same information. So then they can go and, feel comfortable to innovate and push the boundaries for the good of their patients.
Yes.
Wow. Well, I have to tell you, this has been a really fun and informative session. I want to thank you both very, very much. And, we've covered lots of ground, lots of different elements of what goes into EUPs. And we'd like to leave you, the audience, with our typical recommendations about an activity that you can consider undertaking today. Like, what can you do right now to help you or your colleagues, or your organization think a little bit more about the value of EUPs? And a couple of them from our speakers is that you should become familiar with EUPs during peacetime, right? To adequately prepare for public health emergencies when they arise. That EUPs should be embedded in the National Regulatory Agency legal framework, that they should be available so that when the time arises, you don't have to necessarily always think out of the box, as Anna had said, and try to shoehorn your product into existing pathways. And there's always an opportunity to innovate and use regulatory reliance when we think about EUPs. So thank you very, very much. Remember, a recording of this session will be archived shortly on the FR Path website. And we're sure that you'll be able to use these conversation outputs and things that you'll be doing in your respective jobs quickly. Just as a reminder, our next webinar will be on Tuesday, January 24th, 2025, and we'll be posting information about the topic briefly on the FR Path website. As usual, free registration will be available on the website and through LinkedIn, and if you're on our mailing list, through the mailing list. Remember to check out the resources at frpath.org, where you can find more information about Reliance, and you can find all of the archived sessions that we've created over almost the last 3 years. And we will be posting probably in the next day or so a 20-minute audio summary of all of the sessions that we held during 2024. A nice, concise summary, so when you're out there jogging, you can listen to this and get caught up on all of the 2024 FR Panorama sessions. So once again, Mario and I would like to extend a very, very special thank you to our guests, Deborah and Anna. And Mario and I thank you for your interest and participation. All our best until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.